Hey everybody, I want to apologize for not being in class today, but we have things to talk about, so I want to make sure we get them done, and to make sure that happens and make sure we can continue to move forward with our semester. Wanted to go ahead and get this lecture out to you so we would have a sense of to keep moving. So I had to go out of town suddenly and unexpectedly, so I don't think I'm going to be back in time. So this is what we'll do instead. But today we're really getting into the discussions about Latino political participation. That's different than what we've talked about so far. So far in the semester, we've really sort of taken a deeper dive into each of the individual communities, and we'll continue to do that a little bit as we go forward, particularly with the Mexican American community, with the Gutierrez book in a couple of weeks. But right now, we're going to focus on political participation. So there's a nice overview we want to get at first. And as you saw in the chapter, or should read in the chapter as we talk about this and before we move forward on Wednesday and Friday, the Latino vote in American politics is something that has been the focus of both Republican and Democratic candidates for quite some time. This gentleman here on the screen is a man named Lionel Sosa. And Lionel Sosa was well known as a Republican, as someone who was deeply involved. This is just him doing a speaker series event in 2014, but he was deeply involved with the Reagan administration. He was deeply involved with the Bushes. He has been a Latino outreach person for a very, very long time. And Lionel Sosa was famous for giving Ronald Reagan the quote that Latinos are Republicans, they just don't know it yet. And so the idea that the Latino population was a population ready to make a mark on American politics has been well understood by both parties for quite some time. So it's important to think about what that means from a behavioral point of view. What are the demographics? We've already talked about that a little bit, but what are the demographics of this population relative to political participation, both electoral and non-electoral participation, and then what are some of the challenges that this population faces in general as we go forward into the 21st century. So, and I may cough, so I apologize if that happens, but I'll try to cover up the microphone. So, the first thing is that we have been over the demographics, so I won't belabor the point too much. Excuse me. But in Table 2.1, which is on page 17 in Chapter 2 of the Doja book, the the thing that we see here is that if you look at the first column with Latinos and the total U.S. population, you see Latino population is generally younger. The median age, the percent of the population under 18, and the percent of the population over 65 are all basically flipped from the U.S. population. There's fewer people who are older, there are more people under 18, and the median age is very, very low, which all makes a lot of sense. 36% of this population is foreign born, which means that when you're thinking about participation, you don't have, obviously, well over 70% of the population is going to be, or nearly 60% of the population, a little over 60% of the population is native born. But that means you have a significant portion there who are not readily available to vote, because if you're going to vote in a federal election, you have to be a citizen. So have they gone through the citizenship process? What's that stage of that? Do they understand the voting registration process? If you're a new citizen, that can be somewhat daunting. It's different in different places. And so as a result, there's a lot of work that has to go into making sure this community is able to vote and ready and willing to participate earlier on. But you also see that the Latino population is a bit poorer overall. There's a larger percentage of people living in poverty, and there's a much larger percentage of people under 18 living in poverty. That all have its serious implications for political participation. We know that wealthier people participate more. And so if wealthier people are participating more, but you have a segment of the population, an important growing minority group, Latinos, who happen to be poorer in general than the average population, that does not bode well for broad-based political participation. And then we move on to household size. You have a large, so the population living in a household with two people or fewer is only 39%, whereas there's a much larger percentage of that in the overall population. And then obviously there's a big portion of people who live in larger families, more than 5 people in a household. That's a very big household. And then educational attainment. The one key to political participation in American politics is education. More than anything else, we know that education begets political participation. So right now, as we see for the Latino population, they are not as educated overall, they are poorer overall, and they are younger. All of these things make political participation less likely, generally speaking. And so that's why, despite the size and the growth of this population, it is still yet to see itself become the force at the national level that people like such as Ronald Reagan and other very important Republican and of course Democratic officials have been thinking it would be for a very long time. It's just not quite there yet, but the potential is still out there. There's a lot of potential energy. When does that potential energy become kinetic political energy? See, political science, that's a science reference. Keep it going. And table 2.2 is really interesting because here we have it broken down by country of origin, big more than just the groups we've been talking about. You've got your Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, but you also have Dominican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan. Similar breakdowns there. Of course, some of this information is a bit tough because the Puerto Rican community are all native born; they're all U.S. citizens, but so it gets a little tricky there. But what's interesting is that the Cuban population is the oldest population. It's also the most conservative population. And so this is a really interesting aspect. Mexican population is the biggest, Puerto Rican second biggest, Cubans next, but Dominican, Salvadoran are really coming up. Salvadoran actually more than Cuban population if we're looking at this data, which is from the 2011 American Community Survey. So these are some interesting aspects that we looked at just previously. Obviously the Cuban population is a bit wealthier, Puerto Rican population a bit wealthier than the other populations, and so that's why you may see differences in participation likelihood by a group. So that's something that you have to think about as you go forward, thinking about, well, what makes it more or less likely that some person within the Latino community participates or not? Well, what's their country of origin? How deeply socialized? Are they native born? Are they foreign born? In what ways do these things affect those kinds of participatory behaviors are the things we have to think about. So one of the things that we know about political participation is that voting is, of course, sort of the lowest bar, and maybe perhaps you could make a good argument, maybe the most important way to participate. But voting is complex. You have to register to vote. You have to, and obviously, so some of these slides, I apologize, the slides here, as you see, are actually, just me talking about the figures, but I couldn't get the figures onto the slide, so I do apologize about that. So you have to have the book as you follow along. But the thing about voter turnout is that it is, generally speaking, both sort of the lowest bar for participation, but it's still a complex activity. You have to know when the election is. You have to know you have to be registered. You have to get registered. You have to learn about the candidates. You have to then go vote and then start the process all over again. And your vote is unlikely to actually be the deciding vote. So, I mean, it counts, obviously, in a sort of abstract sense, but your vote never makes the difference, right? It's just unlikely that any one single vote ever makes a difference, particularly if we're talking about a federal level election, which is often what we're considering when we think about the Latino population in this way. And so as a result, voting is this sort of strange event where we think it's really important. And of course it is important, but at the same time, it does not have any tangible benefits as a direct result of your participation, which sometimes people get irritated about. But if you look at figures 2.1 through 2.5, you'll see the variation that we see in the Latino community. First of all, for registration, you see the Latino community is quite low in terms of the percent of the population who are registered, right? So Asian Americans and Latino Americans are down near the 30% range, whereas non-white Latino and Black Americans are up near the 70%. So we have pretty good voter registration in America because there's a lot of voter registration going on. And then if you look at the next figure, we're looking at actual voting in presidential elections, and we see similarly that, in fact, the African American and white turnout numbers, voter turnout percent turning out in elections, is relatively high, around 60%, and you consider the amount of people we have registered. We could debate about whether 60% is low or high, but in reality, we have some of the least sort of aggressive voter turnout laws. In some cases around the world, like for instance New Zealand or Australia, you could be fined for not going out to vote. That's simply not the case in the United States, and so as a result, it's pretty impressive. I mean, I'll just say for myself, it's pretty impressive we get 60% turnout among those populations. However, if you look at the Asian American and Latino population turnout, it's still about 30%. There's a lot of work we could do there, and as you see, that stayed pretty stable over the last 30 years or so. Similarly, this is where we get into something a little different. So these previous estimates in figure 2.1, 2.2 are looking at as a percentage of the overall population. So the Asian American and Latino American populations we're obviously talking about a hefty portion of folks who are non-citizens, in fact, right? So these people aren't even eligible to vote in the first place. So it would make sense that the data would look a little lower. So if we look at the actual, as a percentage of citizen population, we still see that Latinos and Asians are a bit lower, but they're not as low as they were compared to the other populations. Similarly, if you look at midterms, everybody votes a little less in midterms, but still the Latino and Asian populations are the lowest. And then finally, if we go on to figure 2.5, we see that again. Still, everybody votes low in midterm elections. Nobody cares about those, wrongly, I should say. But in fact, those populations still vote at the lowest levels. So we know that voter turnout is a problem. And one of the questions we might ask is why? Why is voter turnout a problem? Well, one of the reasons voter turnout is a problem for some communities, particularly, although you might say the African American community is able to overcome much of this, but they were able to overcome much of this because of things like the Voting Rights Act. So the graph you have here on the screen, or I'm sorry, I should say the map, not a graph, but a map, is actually a map of the coverage by county in the United States by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there are two important sections. There's Section 4B and there's Section 5. Section 4B was the section in the Voting Rights Act that set out the formula for deciding if a jurisdiction, a county or city or any jurisdiction, usually at the county level, had discriminated against any minority group within that jurisdiction. And so Section 4B then gave the power to Section 5 to regulate changes to voting rules under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So here's how it works. If you live here in Georgia, this is my hometown right there, LaGrange, Georgia, Troup County. If you lived in Troup County in 1995 and you were an African American, Latino, Asian American, any minority whatsoever who felt that Troup County was trying to discriminate against you, then you could file a civil rights claim. And Troup County, well, first of all, let's back up a second. Let's imagine you live in Troup County. So let's start over. You live in Troup County right here. Troup County decides they want to change the way they do voter registration. They want to limit the number of places you can register. They want to limit the number of places you can vote. Because they are in this red right here, they are covered by the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance requirements. So if Troup County wants to change the way they have people register to vote, they have to appeal with their reasoning to the federal government, to the national government, to say, we want to change the way we do voter registration in our county, and here are the reasons why. And the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, gets to then say whether or not those changes are warranted and constitutionally valid. So all it is you appeal to the national government, to the Department of Justice, and say, we want to make these changes. Does the Department of Justice agree or not? And the reason this happened was because Troup County and all the places in red and the counties in blue and counties in pink, right, these are township coverages, not county coverages, but townships. And blue is county coverage, red is statewide, but it's every county in the state. If the reason this happened is because the places that are colored here in red, blue, and pink have a history of discrimination that is so egregious that it was found through a formula from the Justice Department. And so in some cases it was statewide. So the question we ask is, who's being discriminated against? Well, in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and also Louisiana, was largely African Americans. And the same thing is true in Virginia and North Carolina as well. But in other places, for instance, Florida, right, there were claims of discrimination against Cuban Americans, in some cases, African Americans also in this area. But in Texas and Arizona specifically, there were huge problems of discrimination against Native Americans and Latinos in Arizona, and here Latinos and African Americans in Texas. And so Texas and Arizona and these counties here in California, and these are Native American discrimination issues here, Native American discrimination issues there. These are discrimination issues of a variety of sorts in New Hampshire. Actually, there are real issues with the Canadian population, or the French Canadian, or the French, native French speakers, that have been an issue historically in this region of New England. But so what would happen is that you had this coverage, and this allowed people to make sure that there was no there was nothing unsightly being done with the voting registration rules, and this actually greatly expanded the rates of African American participation in registration. The same thing with Latinos along the border. So it was a really impactful. But you see here these black lines here. These are counties who, after many years of being under the Voting Rights Act Section 5 covered jurisdiction notification, they were able to appeal to the Department of Justice and say, we no longer have these problems. We had historical problems of discrimination. We no longer do. We want to be allowed out of preclearance problems. And so they were. But now, because of the Shelby County versus Holder decision a few years ago, 2014, I believe, Section 4B was declared unconstitutional, which means Section 5 no longer has any relevance. It is basically, it's still there. It's still constitutionally valid as far as the court is concerned, but it has no enforcement mechanism. There's no way to make people go through the Justice Department to have their changes validated. So it's a really interesting situation, and some people are worried that this could actually affect populations like the Latino population or the African American population as we go forward. But here are the percentage of Latinos eligible voters in the United States. And so you see we have a large concentration in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, as we might expect, border states, right? Also Colorado. So historically, the older part of Mexico at one time, right? The western United States. And of course here we still have the borderlands. And of course, this is the Cuban population here, but here we have growing Latino populations, and of course, we have the Puerto Rican population there. And so, as you see, there are certainly regions, and of course, the greater Chicago area here, industrial Midwest. There's a large portion of Latino voters in places which may have had some relationship, not Chicago per se, but with the Voting Rights Act that are no longer there. And so there's some institutional reasons to think that maybe this could affect Latino voter turnout in the future, but we'll just have to wait and see at this time. And one of the things that Latinos and Latino politics has been very successful at doing is actually getting representation. So we actually see this is from the this data is from the NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. You see it down here at the bottom, Source Educational Fund 2014 National. So this tells you in 2014 where all elected officials who were Latino, what level they were elected to, and whether they're male, female, Democrat, Republican, Independent, what have you. So here you have there were 3 male Latino senators. There were 19 male U.S. representatives. There were 9 female U.S. representatives who were Latino. Many of the Latino representatives are Democrats, but there were 2 senators. That's Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, who are Republican, and then 1 Democrat, and that would be Senator Martinez from New Jersey. And then, so then we have state officials, right? There are several state officials, statewide officials is what this should be, who were Latinos, and then you have state senators and state representatives. And so obviously, as a number, these are still relatively low in general, right? If you think about the number of elected officials across the country. So Latinos are making a move. They're getting elected. There are elected officials around. But the statewide level and the Senate level, if you think about representation as a percentage of the population, there's not a lot going on. African Americans are about 15 to 18% of the Congress is African American, which generally reflects the size of the African American population. Right now, the Latino population also makes up about 18% of the U.S. population, but they are less than 18% of the Congress. And so as a result, there's some discrepancy there if you think about sociological representation being important. And then, of course, at the local level, there are a lot of elected officials who are Latino. You have county officials, municipal officials, judicial enforcement, school board, special districts. So there's a lot of people. There's 6,084 elected Latinos in 2014, which, considering that the Latino population has all of the barriers we've discussed, that's a lot of good news in a lot of places, although not to say that there isn't room to grow, right? If that's your objective, if you'd like to see more elected officials who are Latino, there's obviously room to grow. On the other hand, when you consider the institutional barriers, immigration historically as a barrier, and then of course language of choice, this is some good news to see so many people who are from the Latino community elected to office. So this really brings us to political engagement. And the real question is, if, we've seen what political engagement looks like from an electoral point of view, but what about non-electoral participation? So non-electoral participation comes in a variety of forms, and you can look at Table 2.3 and think about that. In Table 2.3, we've got, by country of origin, if people are somewhat interested. So this is about political interest. Have you ever contacted elected officials, to solve a problem? Have you ever attended a community meeting? Things like that. And so, as you see, there seems to be relatively high interest in politics among Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Dominican populations, but Salvadoran and Guatemalan a little lower. In terms of having contacted a public official to express concerns, that's still relatively low. But you see the Puerto Rican and Cuban populations seem to have done that at a higher rate. And the reason is because, again, the Puerto Rican and Cuban populations are the two Latino populations who would be most comfortable, most engaged in the political process overall to have done such a thing. And you see that that has happened. If you also think about the number of Puerto Rican people of Puerto Rican heritage who have been elected to offices in New York City or other city governments. That's another reason, right? These people know their elected officials, and they are happy to contact them to make their voices known. Similarly, if you look at, prefer to resolve problems through existing organizations, those are relatively low, and then prefer to resolve problems informally. There's a little higher percentage in certain places, particularly Dominicans and Cubans, and that could be aspects of working through things without using formal institutions. But the other aspect of that is that there's simply just a reticence to go through the institutional process because of perhaps a lack of representation or a lack of efficacy, right? The feeling that you can make a difference. And so those are all very important, and we know that knowledge, efficacy, and trust are related to political participation. So to the extent that these communities are lower on those measures, and by the way, most Americans are quite low on those measures these days, that's where we see some lower levels of participation. So this really brings us to some questions to consider for the future. So this is just a general overview. I hope you've read the chapter, and I hope you can read the chapter again after us having this short video to talk about this. And then when we come back on Wednesday, we'll really go after it. And then your next short paper will be due next Saturday. So I want to give you the week to really think about it and use some more information. So some questions we're going to really think about are, number one, what are the predictors of Latino political participation? We've seen some in this chapter, and we're going to see some as we read more. But I want you to think about that. What are the predictors of Latino political participation? We know what they are overall in American politics. What are they in Latino politics? And we'll talk about those in class. How does language and identity play into this political participation equation, right? Because we know that, obviously, if Spanish is your language of choice, or depending on how you identify with your country of origin or as Latino, perhaps that changes the way in which you may want to participate. And then there are also questions about transnational ties. If you have ties with family in your home country or your country of origin, what's that mean about your willingness to participate? If you participate back home, do you also participate back here? It's just it's an open question. And there's some good research on this that we'll get into. It's just a burgeoning field. And then, of course, what's the impact of SES? We know that people who have higher levels of income and higher levels of education participate more generally in American politics. What about in the Latino community? All right, this is a community that overall, in the aggregate, is lower on levels of education, is lower on levels of income, and is sort of is still working their way through the socioeconomic strata. But the fact is that there are people in the Latino community who are extremely well educated and extremely wealthy. So do those people participate similar to the overall American public, or are there differences still because of their being Latino? Are there impacts there? What are the issues they care about? And then finally, what other institutions play key roles in encouraging or inhibiting Latino political participation? Specifically, are we thinking about churches? Are we thinking about social groups, civic organizations, fraternal organizations? How do these institutions affect behavior? Do they encourage behavior? Do they inhibit behavior? Do they cause problems? What's going on there? So all of these are questions we're going to consider, and I really appreciate you working with me and dealing with this short video. So email with questions or concerns, and I will see you on Wednesday, unless you want to come in my office on Tuesday, in which case send me an email. I'll be there. Let me know. Thanks a lot.